I'm joined here in the studio by political analyst Mboweni and researcher Neil Coleman, who is a co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice, who joins me via Skype. Good evening to both of you gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining me. Let me start with you, Neil Coleman, if I may. The set of tweets that you put out makes it very clear that you really do not like what actually happened. Why? Tell us why.
Well, Vuyo, to understand that, I think we need to realize that there's a long history. Since 1996, when the macroeconomic program GEAR was brought out and was announced by the then Treasury Director General as being non-negotiable, President Nelson Mandela told the COSATU Congress that macroeconomic framework was never discussed in the ANC National Executive before it was announced. And we've seen that type of behavior repeated by Treasury over many, many years. It's particularly worrying that we are in a deep economic crisis, and therefore any major announcement by government on a recovery package needs to really have the buy-in and the participation and contributions of government, of the governing party, and as far as possible consultation with civil society. Because when you design a house and you build the house, and then you ask people to comment on the interior decorating of that house, that is cosmetic. So the very structure of this document is extremely problematic. And the Statistician General today described it as simply a rehash of old policies. And he's correct in that sense. The economy is in a deep crisis. We need to get the economy moving. But the document does nothing to address that. Rather, it focuses on medium-term microeconomic interventions and ignores the whole question of macroeconomic interventions, whether fiscal or monetary. And in fact, the entire document doesn't mention government's fiscal stimulus, which is bizarre, that it's a Treasury document.
So you don't see it as a call to engage?
As I said, Vuyo, if you design a document and you don't engage with your partners in government and outside of government in designing that document, the product is going to reflect that. And we believe, well, I believe, and the Institute believes, that Treasury has a fundamentally flawed conception of the roots of this economic crisis. They constantly focus on things like macroeconomic stability in a very narrow sense, looking at macroeconomic indicators. And in doing that, what they do is they worsen the problem. We have a problem of stagnation. And what they're doing is they're deepening that problem of economic stagnation through, for example, the economic austerity program that they announced last week, just before Treasury released this document unilaterally.
Okay. Mr. Mboweni, your thoughts upon reading this document? Do you feel as strongly against it as Mr. Neil Coleman seems to be?
No, I don't feel strongly against the document at all. I think the issue where the differences are is what is the purpose of the document and whose document is it? Many people are under the impression that it's Tito Mboweni's document. Actually, it's a South African government document, and the document says prepared by Economic Policy Unit of the National Treasury. It's prepared by a government department for the government of South Africa. So that, to me, is what I understand the document to be. Now, we can debate the pros and cons of many issues that are raised in the document. But I think we have to understand what the document is, what it is intended to do. In my view, the document is really preparing the South African population for the downgrading that South Africa faces from Moody's in the coming 2 or 3 months. So it is saying to the population, these are some of the issues that we have to consider in the light of the downgrading that we're faced with. So that's part of the is to try and say to the population, do not panic, we are looking into this matter, we are trying to come up with a solution. That's one purpose of the document. The other purpose, of course, is to say to Moody's that we are discussing with our population. We can't just act on our own as a government without consultation with the population. Now, what we see with COSATU and the Communist Party and my friend Neil Coleman is they are saying, no, you must talk to us first, not talk to the people of South Africa before you talk to us. Well, that's a debate between the ANC and the Communist Party and COSATU and their partners. But what the government has chosen to do was to talk to the people directly.
Mr. Coleman, does it matter how this thing is done? In other words, is it a prerequisite, in your view, that the government should have spoken to its alliance partners and fraternal organizations first before government puts this document out?
Well, it's inconceivable that technocrats in a government department working with outside consultants can cobble together a document, which, by the way, is very incoherent, as I can elaborate on further. They can cobble together this document, which deals with other government departments, for example, deals with the Industrial Policy Action Plan, makes certain conclusions about the role of services and manufacturing, and it hasn't reflected the thinking of other government departments in what is supposed to be, if you to believe what Moletsi is saying, is supposed to be a government document, a government strategy. So there's nothing wrong with government coming out with a strategy document and asking for comment. That's what government has repeatedly done over the last 25 years. But when it's one department that has gone rogue and has unilaterally prepared a document, and on our information, there's actually an interdepartmental government process that was happening, which has been short-circuited by the release of this document. I mean, that is highly irresponsible in a situation that Moletsi was describing, where the economy is on a knife edge, the rating agencies are looking at us, the population, most importantly, more than the ratings agency, are looking for a solution to the dire economic situation in which we find ourselves. So you can't just publish a discussion document with tens of pages of academic footnotes and hope that you're now going to open up a academic discussion in the community. People are looking to government for a serious alternative and solution to the crisis that we face. So I really don't think it's correct to dismiss the concerns lightly, as Moletsi has done.
Would it not have been prudent, Mr. Mbeki, for perhaps consensus to have been sought first, perhaps within a government especially, and especially given what Neil Coleman is raising, that it says a lot of things about a whole range of departments that are obviously affected by, whatever positions this document puts forward?
Well, it depends. At the end of the day, we have to hear what the president has to say. If the president says this guy jumped the gun, that the National Treasury jumped the gun, then that's what happened. If, on the other hand, the president says, I instructed these people to do what they've done, well, that's the end of the story. We may disagree, Neil may disagree, COSATU may disagree, but that's how the president of the country sees. So we have to, in a way, wait for him to comment on the thing. Neil mentioned the issue of gear. I think he was at the conference where Mandela was faced with gear at a COSATU Congress. I think the Minister Mantashe was also at that Congress. What I remember Mandela said to COSATU, they were denouncing the document. Mandela said to COSATU, GIE is ANC policy. The ANC is a voluntary organization. If you, the members of COSATU, don't like ANC policy, you are free to leave. That's what Mandela said in the context of GEAR. So if we're going to go back, that's what I remember Mandela saying.
But what appeals to you the most upon reading this document? What for you is most important, the most important things that it raises or it puts on the table?
Well, what it is trying to do is to allay fears, in my view. It is to allay fears by the public that the government doesn't have an economic policy, that it doesn't know what it is doing, that it is not on top of its game. That's what the document, to me, is trying to say. And now, I have lots of agreements and disagreements with some of the things. Some of them are actually quite old. Some of them are policies that the government has been hiding, which have been worked on, for example, on the railways. There's a document which was prepared as far back as 2005, which said the private sector, which was commissioned by the government, which said private sector operators should be introduced into to run their trains on the railways. This has now been put on the table by this document. Now, in a way, we know our railways are in a mess. So it's not a bad thing to introduce private sector operators into the railway system in South Africa to overcome the horrendous mess that it is in. But the document comments on a huge number of issues. So I can't say this one is correct, that unless we go word by word through this enormous
which we don't have the time to do tonight. Neil Coleman, notwithstanding your procedural and other issues, is there nothing in the document that appeals to you?
No, Vuyo, there's some good ideas in the document. There's no doubt about it. The problem, though, is that the document is incoherent. For example, if you look at page 17 of the document, it's got a very powerful statement as to why the manufacturing sector is so important economically, in terms of the value chains, in terms of being the engine of economic development. But then later on in the document, it completely reverses that and says that the aim is, of the policies that they recommend, is that the services sector will increase from 2/3 of the economy to 75% of the economy over 7 to 10 years. Now that is clearly crazy to talk about an industrialization strategy in which you see the manufacturing sector shrinking further, where we've already got a problem of deindustrialization. I could give you other examples where the document is incoherent. The most amazing thing about the document is that it comes from National Treasury, which sees itself as the custodian of macroeconomic policy. Yet the document has nothing to say about macroeconomic policy. The word stimulus is not mentioned once in the document. It doesn't deal with monetary policy. It barely deals with fiscal policy. It parrots the NDP approach that really what we need are microeconomic interventions. And that approach, which has been tried by Treasury over the last 10 or so years, has failed dismally, and we are now in a serious economic crisis. Therefore, the bits and pieces in the document that are interesting and good really are not taken forward in a coherent manner, but overall, you cannot say that this is an economic recovery strategy. It simply doesn't foot that bill in any respect.
Mr. Mboweni, your thoughts about how we can now move forward, because at the end of the day we are, as you have correctly pointed out, facing a huge crisis, and perhaps the ANC should be left to resolve its internal issues or issues with Fraternal and its allies. If you were sitting in the position of the ANC president, what would you do now, given the flood of negative reaction, as it were, from your allies and people you want next to you?
Yes, I think the issue of the ANC and its allies is a totally different matter from the South African government's economic policies. So what is happening here is all these are being bundled up together, and this is creating a lot of confusion. Of course, for the allies of the ANC who feel that the ANC is ignoring them. This is a good opportunity for them to go to the public and complain about the ANC leadership ignoring them. But if we go back to the fundamentals of the South African economy now, what is the problem with the South African economy, and what is the problem with the way the ANC is managing the South African economy? The fundamental problem is that this ANC policy is focused on driving consumption. It's not focused on driving investment. So what we see since the ANC came into power is very low levels of investment that on the whole are below 20% of gross domestic product. According to the National Development Plan, they should be at 30% of gross domestic product. So this is the fundamental problem, is that the ANC government is taking resources from the productive side of the economy through the tax structure and transferring them to the consumption side, for example, building up this massive civil service, building up this hugely expensive parastatal, which is very unproductive, and then has to be propped up through borrowing. So that is what is fundamentally wrong with the policies of the ANC government. So I think this is what we should be focusing on, and we should be going to the rating agencies and saying to the rating agency, we are going to change our policy from being consumption-driven to being investment-driven. All the millions of detail that are in that document don't help the direction in which the economy is going.
Political analyst Mboweni and researcher Neil Coleman from the Institute for Economic Justice.